The boy returned from school every day without pocket money, but he stubbornly avoided talking about it. The father began to suspect that something was wrong and decided to find out the truth. He hid the device in his son's backpack and was shocked. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and write in the comments where you're watching us from. Jaden walked through the front door, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his expression unreadable. His father, Marcus, sitting at the dining table, glanced up from his laptop and observed his son carefully. The way Jaden moved, the way he hesitated at the threshold as if bracing himself before stepping inside, it wasn't normal. There was a tension in his posture, an unspoken weight pressing down on him. He barely acknowledged his father's presence, offering only a brief nod before making his way toward his bedroom. Marcus closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Something wasn't right. This wasn't the first time Jaden had come home looking like this, quiet, withdrawn, almost reluctant to engage in conversation. He had always been a reserved kid, but over the past few weeks his silence had grown heavier, his smiles less frequent, his energy drained as if something was slowly eating away at him. Marcus had noticed it, but had assumed it was just school stress, a phase, or maybe even teenage mood swings. But now he wasn't so sure. Deciding not to let his suspicions fester, he got up and walked toward Jaden's room. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, his son sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor. His backpack lay beside him, unopened, as if he had no intention of even looking at it. "Dinner will be ready in a bit," Marcus said casually, leaning against the doorframe. "What do you feel like eating tonight?" Jaden shrugged without looking up. "Anything's fine." Marcus studied him for a moment. "You hungry?" A brief hesitation, then a nod. He hadn't missed the way Jaden's fingers clenched slightly at his jeans when the question was asked. Marcus pushed off the doorframe and headed to the kitchen. He decided to make something hearty, something Jaden couldn't resist. Pasta with a rich tomato sauce, grilled chicken on the side, and fresh bread. The smell soon filled the house, and when he called his son for dinner, Jaden appeared almost immediately. They sat at the table, and for a few moments the only sound was the clinking of silverware against plates. Marcus watched as his son ate, noticing the way he devoured the food with a hunger that seemed excessive. It wasn't just a healthy appetite. It was the kind of hunger that suggested he hadn't eaten all day. "When was the last time you ate?" Marcus asked, keeping his tone light. Jaden didn't look up. "Lunch? School lunch?" A nod. Marcus frowned slightly. "What did you have?" Jaden hesitated again. "Just the usual." Marcus didn't press further, but something wasn't adding up. If he was eating lunch at school, why did he come home acting as if he hadn't eaten in days? Why did he avoid eye contact whenever food was mentioned? Later that night, as Marcus washed the dishes, his mind kept circling back to what he had seen. The exhaustion in his son's eyes. The avoidance. The way he had inhaled his food. He dried his hands, walked over to the dining table, and picked up his wallet. Every morning, he gave Jaden a small amount of cash, just enough for lunch and a little extra in case he needed anything. He never asked for receipts, never checked to see how it was spent. That night, before going to bed, he made a mental note to start paying closer attention. The next morning, as Jaden got ready for school, Marcus casually slipped a $20 bill into his son's hand. "Here, for lunch," he said. Jaden glanced at the money, then at his father. "I don't need that much." "Consider it a bonus," Marcus said with a small smile. "Maybe grab a snack for later." Jaden hesitated, but then nodded and pocketed the cash before slinging his backpack over his shoulder. Marcus watched as his son left for school, his gut tightening. Something was off. He just didn't know what yet. That evening, Jaden walked through the door at the usual time. His expression was neutral, but Marcus could tell he was on edge. "Hey," Marcus called from the kitchen. "How was school?" Jaden kicked off his shoes. "Fine." Marcus wiped his hands on a towel. "You get anything good for lunch today?" Jaden's shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Yeah." "What'd you have?" Another hesitation, then, too quickly, "Pizza." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "From the cafeteria?" Jaden nodded. Marcus crossed his arms. "So, you still have some change from this morning?" Jaden's reaction was subtle but telling. His eyes flickered slightly, and he shifted his weight as if suddenly uncomfortable. "No, I used it all." "All 20? "Yeah." Marcus nodded slowly, suppressing the growing unease curling in his stomach. Something wasn't right. His son was lying to him, and the worst part was that he clearly didn't want to. Over the next few days, Marcus continued to observe. The pattern was always the same. Jaden left with money in the morning, came home acting like he hadn't eaten, and avoided any discussion about what he spent the money on. When Marcus offered to pack a lunch instead, Jaden hesitated before declining, saying he preferred to eat at school. It didn't make sense. Then another thing caught Marcus's attention. One afternoon, while tidying up, he happened to check Jaden's backpack. He wasn't snooping, just making sure everything was in order, but something stood out immediately. His wallet was empty, no receipts, no leftover change. It was as if the money had vanished completely. The realization settled in his chest like a heavy weight. His son wasn't spending the money. It was disappearing. That night, Marcus sat at the kitchen table staring at his phone. He could confront Jaden directly, but something told him that wouldn't get him any answers. His son was scared. Of what, he didn't know yet, but pushing too hard might make him retreat further. No, he needed to be smart about this. He glanced at the clock. Tomorrow he would try something different. He would hand Jaden his lunch money as usual, but this time he would take extra precautions. He needed to know the truth. The next morning, Marcus watched as Jaden prepared for school, his every movement precise and methodical. His son had always been a quiet, thoughtful boy, but there was something different about the way he carried himself now. It was as if he was trying to move through the morning unnoticed, slipping through the routine without drawing attention. Marcus noted how he avoided eye contact, how he hesitated slightly before reaching for his backpack. The same hesitation had been there for weeks, small enough to ignore at first, but now glaringly obvious. Marcus handed him the usual amount of money and, as always, received the same brief nod in return. Jaden tucked the cash into his pocket without looking at it, slung his backpack over his shoulder, and made his way to the door. Marcus hesitated, considering whether to say something, maybe remind him to eat well, maybe joke about bringing home change, but he knew none of it would make a difference. Whatever was happening, Jaden had already decided he wasn't going to talk about it. After the door closed behind him, Marcus sighed and rubbed his temples. The unease from last night hadn't left him. In fact, it had settled deeper into his chest, a weight that wouldn't lift. He wasn't the kind of parent who pried into every little thing, but this wasn't a small matter. His son was coming home hungry, the money he gave him was vanishing, and no explanation he provided added up. The day dragged. At work, Marcus found himself checking the time more often than usual, watching the minutes crawl by as he imagined different scenarios. Was Jaden simply losing the money? Had he fallen into a group that pressured him to spend it recklessly? Or was something worse at play? Each possibility made him more restless. When the afternoon finally arrived, he left the office early, arriving home before Jaden did. He sat at the kitchen table, waiting, his hands clasped together in front of him. Jaden walked through the door at the usual time, his face carefully blank. The moment he saw his father sitting there, his posture changed. Just the slightest tightening of his shoulders, a subtle shift in his stance. It was barely noticeable, but Marcus caught it. He greeted him casually, but Jaden only mumbled a response, kicking off his shoes and heading straight for his room. Marcus let him go. He didn't want to push, not yet. Later that evening, when Jaden finally joined him for dinner, Marcus decided to try again, this time more carefully. He watched as his son ate, noting how quickly he finished his food, how he barely paused between bites. There was hunger there, real hunger, the kind that couldn't be explained by a normal school day. "You must have had a light lunch," Marcus said, keeping his voice light. Jaden shrugged, reaching for his water glass. "Yeah, I guess. What was it today?" "Just the usual." His answer was automatic, rehearsed. "Pizza again?" Marcus pressed, a brief hesitation. "Yeah." "And you used all the money?" Another hesitation. "Yeah." It was the same response as the day before, down to the exact words. Too neat, too practiced. Marcus didn't believe it for a second. After dinner, while Jaden was showering, Marcus decided to check something. He went into his son's room, scanning it briefly before kneeling beside the backpack that lay against the wall. He unzipped the main compartment, feeling a pang of guilt for going through his son's things, but the worry overpowered the guilt. He reached into the smaller pocket, the one where Jaden usually kept his money. Empty. Not even a single crumpled bill. Not even loose change. Marcus sat back on his heels, staring at the bag, the weight in his chest growing heavier. The money was gone. Not spent, just gone. He needed to approach this differently. If Jaden wasn't going to tell him willingly, Marcus had to find a way to uncover the truth on his own. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought through his options. If his son was in trouble, if someone was taking advantage of him, the last thing Marcus wanted to do was make him feel cornered. But he needed answers. The next morning, he decided to try something new. Instead of simply handing Jaden the money, he made a suggestion. "Why don't you keep it in the inside pocket of your backpack?" he said as he passed the cash over. "That way, it won't fall out of your pocket." Jaden blinked at him for a second before nodding slowly. Okay. It was a small test. If his son really was just misplacing the money, this would eliminate that possibility. That evening, after Jaden had gone to his room, Marcus checked the backpack again. Empty. So much for that. The next few days played out the same way. Marcus experimented with different methods, asking Jaden to keep the money in different places, giving him slightly more than usual, casually suggesting he buy something specific so he'd have to bring back change. No matter what, the result was the same. The money was disappearing into thin air, and Jaden wasn't talking. Marcus sat at the kitchen table that night, staring at his phone, frustration simmering beneath his skin. He had thought about calling the school, asking around, maybe even checking if there had been any reports of bullying. But without proof, without knowing exactly what was happening, what would he even say? His son refused to talk, and any direct attempt to force the truth out of him might just push him further into silence. He rubbed his hands over his face, exhaling slowly. There had to be another way. Then an idea began to form. If Jaden wouldn't tell him, if the money kept disappearing without explanation, then maybe he needed to see for himself. He pulled out his laptop and began searching. It didn't take long before he found what he was looking for. Small, discreet recording devices, easy to hide, capable of picking up sound from a decent distance. He read through the specifications, choosing one that seemed reliable, one that could last a full school day on a single charge. It wasn't ideal. He didn't like the idea of spying on his son, but this wasn't just about curiosity anymore. It was about Jaden's well-being. If something was happening at school, if someone was taking his money, coercing him into handing it over, Marcus needed to know. By the time he closed his laptop, he had made his decision. Tomorrow he would place the recorder in Jaden's backpack. And by tomorrow night, he would finally have the truth. Marcus woke before his alarm. His mind had been restless through the night, playing and replaying the plan he had formed the previous evening. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he questioned himself. Was this the right thing to do? Would Jaden see it as a betrayal? Would it make things worse instead of better? But the moment he thought of his son's quiet hesitations, the guarded way he spoke about school, the empty wallet in his backpack, his hesitation evaporated. This was not a harmless oversight. Something was happening to his son, and Marcus was done waiting for an answer that might never come on its own. He slipped out of bed and moved carefully through the house, not wanting to wake Jaden before it was time. The recording device sat on the kitchen counter, small enough to fit in the palm of his hand. He had spent time the previous night testing it, making sure it was functional. The audio quality was clear enough to pick up voices at a reasonable distance, and the battery would last the full day. It was as discreet as it could be. Small, black, featureless. If placed correctly, Jaden would never even notice it. By the time his son finally shuffled into the kitchen, Marcus was already making breakfast. He turned, studying Jaden as he rubbed his tired eyes, his movement sluggish with morning drowsiness. There was a time when his son had greeted mornings with more energy, more life. He wasn't just physically tired. He was carrying something heavy, something he refused to share. And Marcus was going to find out what it was. As usual, he handed Jaden his lunch money. The boy took it without question, shoving it into his backpack without looking. That was when Marcus saw his opportunity. As Jaden sat at the table, absently pushing his eggs around on the plate, Marcus casually picked up the backpack from where it rested on the floor under the counter. "Your strap is starting to tear," he said, frowning as he examined it. Jaden barely glanced up. "Huh?" "Oh, it's fine." Marcus ran a finger along the frayed edge. "I should fix this before it gets worse. I'll sew it later tonight." His son only shrugged, uninterested, and returned to eating. It was all the time Marcus needed. His hands moved quickly, fingers slipping into the front compartment. The tiny recorder fit snugly into the fabric lining, secured in a way that it wouldn't shift around or be noticed unless someone was specifically looking for it. He zipped the bag back up, setting it down beside Jaden's chair. "You sure you don't need a new one?" Marcus asked, keeping his tone casual. "It's fine," Jaden repeated. "Really?" Marcus let it go. He had what he needed. The morning went on as usual. Jaden finished his breakfast, grabbed his backpack, and headed toward the door. As he stepped outside, Marcus leaned against the kitchen counter, watching him go, his jaw tight. He hated this. Hated that he had been forced into such a position. Hated that his son felt he couldn't come to him. But most of all, he hated the uncertainty, the growing fear that whatever he was about to hear on that recorder would be worse than anything he had imagined. The hours dragged by. At work, Marcus found himself unable to focus, his mind drifting constantly to the small device hidden in his son's bag. Every scenario played through his mind. Was Jaden being bullied? Was someone stealing from him? Was he being pressured into handing over his money, forced to keep quiet under the threat of something worse? Every possibility made his pulse quicken. By the time the afternoon rolled around, he was already on his way home, leaving work early under the excuse of not feeling well. He needed to be there when Jaden walked through the door. He needed to see him, to look him in the eyes before listening to whatever truth lay waiting for him in that recording. The moment Jaden stepped inside, Marcus could tell it had been another long day. His son's shoulders were tense, his movements quick, as if eager to get to his room. He mumbled a greeting, kicked off his shoes, and started toward the hallway. "Hey," Marcus called. "How was school?" Jaden stopped, but he didn't turn around. "Fine." Marcus kept his voice light. "Yeah, what'd you have for lunch?" Jaden hesitated, his fingers twitching at his side. "Just a sandwich." "And you spent all the money?" A longer pause. "Yeah." Marcus watched him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, go get your homework started." Jaden disappeared down the hall without another word. Marcus waited until he heard the bedroom door close before he moved. His steps were slow, measured, as he walked to the kitchen and reached for the backpack resting against the chair. His hands were steady as he unzipped the front pocket, fingers closing around the small recording device. He took a deep breath. Then he pressed play. At first, there was nothing unusual. The sounds of morning chatter filled the speaker. Children talking, lockers slamming, the occasional scrape of shoes against the hallway floor. Then, Jaden's voice, faint but clear enough to recognize, exchanging a few words with someone, a friend, maybe. He kept his tone even, firm but gentle. "I wasn't trying to invade your privacy. I was trying to protect you." Jaden's jaw tightened. He looked away again, staring at the far wall as if willing himself to be somewhere else. "It's Mr. Clark, isn't it?" Marcus pressed. "Your math teacher." Jaden inhaled sharply, his shoulders tensing. Another silent confirmation. Marcus felt his hands tighten into fists. "How long has this been going on?" Jaden hesitated, then mumbled, "A while." "How long, Jaden?" The boy swallowed hard. "Since last semester." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, swallowing back the anger rising in his throat. "Months. This has been happening for months." "Did he ever threaten you?" Jaden shook his head quickly. "Not really. He just made it sound like it was normal, like it was something I had to do." His voice was barely above a whisper. "He said I wouldn't want to get in trouble." Marcus clenched his teeth. It was worse than he thought. This wasn't just some random act of theft. This was control, manipulation, psychological coercion. Mr. Clark hadn't needed to make open threats. He had planted the idea in Jaden's mind that refusing wasn't an option. Marcus took a slow, steadying breath. "Jaden, listen to me. What he's been doing is wrong. It's not a rule, it's not normal, and you're not the one who should feel ashamed." Jaden's fingers trembled slightly where they rested on his knee. He kept his eyes down. "But if you tell the school, what if he gets mad?" Marcus forced his hands to relax, unclenching his fists. "That's not going to happen. I won't let it." Jaden was silent for a long moment, his brows furrowing. There was something vulnerable in his face, something Marcus hadn't seen in a long time. A part of him that was still just a kid, afraid of upsetting the balance of a world he barely had control over. Marcus reached out and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I need you to trust me, buddy. I'm going to handle this. But I need to know you're okay." Jaden hesitated, then finally he nodded. "Okay." Marcus squeezed his shoulder gently before standing up. "I need to take care of something," he said, his voice firm. Jaden didn't ask what. He only nodded again. Marcus left the room, his mind already shifting to the next step. The anger he had forced down earlier was creeping back, but now it was sharper, more controlled. This wasn't just about Jaden anymore. How many other kids had Mr. Clark done this to? He walked back to the kitchen, grabbed the recording device, and sat down at the table. He played the recording one last time, letting the words cement themselves in his mind. He needed to be absolutely certain of his next move. Then, without hesitation, he picked up his phone and dialed the number for the school. The line rang twice before a voice answered. "This is Principal Reynolds." Marcus's grip on the phone tightened. "We need to talk." Marcus arrived at the school earlier than planned. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles tight as he stared at the large brick building ahead. The morning sun cast long shadows over the parking lot, and for a moment he just sat there, breathing, trying to calm the storm brewing inside him. He had barely slept the night before, his mind replaying the recording over and over, each time stoking the anger, the helplessness, the cold determination that had settled in his chest. This wasn't just about Jaden anymore. If Mr. Clark had done this to his son, there was a good chance other students had suffered the same treatment. That thought alone sent a fresh wave of fury through him. He didn't know how far this went, how many kids had been coerced into silence, how many had been forced to hand over what little they had. But he was going to find out. He exhaled sharply and pushed open the car door. His steps were steady, measured, but each one carried weight. He wasn't just here as a concerned parent. He was here to put an end to whatever was happening inside these walls. The school office was quiet when he entered. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with short, graying hair, glanced up from her computer, offering a polite smile. "Mr. Turner, good morning. The principal is expecting you." Marcus nodded, barely acknowledging the greeting. He had no interest in small talk. She gestured towards the closed office door. "Go right in." Principal Reynolds was seated behind his desk, his expression unreadable as Marcus stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The office was neat, organized, the bookshelves lined with neatly arranged binders and certificates. It was the kind of space that projected authority, order. Marcus wondered how much of that order was real, and how much of it was just an illusion. "Mr. Turner," Reynolds said, folding his hands on the desk. "I understand you have some concerns about Jaden." Marcus sat down slowly, his movements deliberate. He pulled the recording device from his pocket and placed it on the desk between them. "I have more than concerns," he said, his voice level but firm. "I have proof." Reynolds raised an eyebrow but didn't reach for the device. "Proof of what, exactly?" Marcus leaned forward slightly. "My son has been coming home hungry for months. Every day, I give him money for lunch. Every day, that money disappears. He wouldn't talk about it. He avoided my questions. So, I put this in his backpack." He nodded toward the recorder. "And I found out that your math teacher has been taking his money." Reynolds' expression flickered just for a second before settling into something more carefully neutral. "That's a serious accusation." Marcus scoffed, crossing his arms. "Don't treat me like I'm guessing. I have it all on tape. Mr. Clark has been forcing my son to hand over his money. He made it sound like a rule, like something Jaden had to do to stay out of trouble. That's manipulation. That's theft. And I'm willing to bet my son isn't the only one." Reynolds's jaw tightened. He exhaled slowly, then finally reached for the recorder. He plugged in a pair of earbuds, pressed play, and, as the audio filled his ears, his face changed. His lips pressed into a thin line, his fingers tightening around the small device as the familiar voices played back. Jaden's hesitant compliance, Clark's firm, quiet commands, the rustle of money being taken. When the recording ended, Reynolds sat back, removed the earbuds, and was silent for a long moment. Marcus watched him, waiting. Finally, the principal spoke. "This is unacceptable." "You're damn right it is." Marcus's voice was cold. "And I want to know what you're going to do about it." Reynolds hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I will handle this internally. Mr. Clark will be questioned, and appropriate actions will be taken." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "That's not good enough." The principal looked at him, his expression cautious. "Mr. Turner, I understand your anger, but there are procedures we have to follow. We can't just—" Marcus slammed his hand down on the desk, making Reynolds flinch. "Don't talk to me about procedures," he growled. "You have a teacher stealing from kids, my kid, and you're telling me you need time to figure out what to do. No, you suspend him, you launch a full investigation, and if you try to sweep this under the rug, I swear I will take this to the school board, to the media, to the police." Reynolds exhaled through his nose, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he nodded. "All right. I'll call Mr. Clark in." Marcus leaned back, crossing his arms. "Good. I want to be here for that conversation." The principal hesitated again, but then nodded once more. He picked up the phone on his desk and dialed an extension. "Mr. Clark, could you come to my office, please?" His tone was neutral, unreadable. A pause. "Yes, now." Marcus didn't move. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his face unreadable. He had imagined this moment 100 times since hearing the recording. He had thought about what he would say, how he would react. But now that it was actually happening, he realized words might not even be necessary. The truth was already out. And now it was time for Mr. Clark to face it. It only took a few minutes before the door opened and Mr. Clark stepped inside. The man was tall, lean, his hair neatly combed, his suit pressed as if he had walked right out of a catalog. His expression was carefully composed, but Marcus saw the flicker of something, hesitation, maybe even concern, when his gaze met his. "Have a seat, Mr. Clark," Reynolds said, gesturing to the chair beside Marcus. Clark lowered himself into the seat, adjusting his tie. "What's this about?" His voice was smooth, casual. Too casual. Marcus didn't speak. He let the principal take the lead. Reynolds folded his hands on the desk. "Mr. Clark, we've received a serious allegation regarding your conduct with students." Clark's brows lifted slightly, but he didn't look surprised. "Really? And what allegation would that be?" Marcus finally spoke, his voice like ice. "That you've been stealing from my son." Clark turned his head slightly, eyes settling on Marcus with something unreadable. "That's a bold claim." "It's not a claim." Marcus reached for the recorder, pressing play. The room filled with the sound of Jaden's hesitant voice, followed by Clark's calm, measured commands. The sound of money being taken. The damning final words, "Eat at home." Clark's expression barely shifted, but Marcus saw it. The briefest flicker of tension in his jaw, the small inhale through his nose. The realization that he had been caught. When the recording ended, silence settled over the room. Reynolds exhaled, shaking his head. "Mr. Clark, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Clark adjusted his tie again. This is being taken out of context. Marcus laughed, the sound sharp, humorless. Out of context? His voice was deadly quiet. My son has been handing over his lunch money for months. You made him think he had no choice. That's not out of context. That's you getting caught. Reynolds leaned forward. Mr. Clark, I'm placing you on immediate suspension pending further investigation. You are to leave the premises immediately. Clark didn't argue. He didn't protest. He only exhaled through his nose, stood up, and straightened his suit. You're making a mistake, he said, looking directly at Reynolds. Marcus clenched his fists, every muscle in his body taut, but he forced himself to stay still. The fight wasn't over yet. Clark walked to the door. He paused just for a second, then left without another word. As soon as the door shut, Reynolds turned to Marcus. I'll handle the next steps from here, but I want you to know I won't let this slide. Marcus nodded, standing. See that you don't. Then he turned and walked out, knowing this was far from over. Marcus walked out of the principal's office with the weight of the conversation still pressing on his chest. The air in the hallway felt stifling, thick with something invisible but undeniable. The confrontation had been expected, but even now, with Clark temporarily removed from the school, Marcus knew this was far from over. His hands were still curled into fists, the tension in his jaw refusing to loosen. As he moved through the hallway, students passed by, their chatter blending into a dull hum in his ears. None of them seemed aware of the battle that had just taken place behind the closed doors of the principal's office. To them, this was just another school day, another morning filled with the usual chaos of classes and hurried conversations. But for Marcus, this was the beginning of something much larger. He stepped outside, inhaling the crisp air deeply, trying to settle the slow burn and anger still coursing through his veins. His mind raced with everything that had happened. The recording, the way Clark had barely flinched when confronted, the dismissive arrogance in his eyes. Marcus had wanted a reaction, some sign of remorse, but Clark had given him nothing. No guilt, no fear, no shame, just calm, measured indifference. That alone told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't a man who had made a mistake. This was someone who had done this before. Marcus reached his car, resting his hands on the roof for a moment, grounding himself. He couldn't go home yet. Not now. He wasn't done. He needed to think to figure out his next move. The principal had promised action, but Marcus didn't trust the system to handle this alone. Clark had been suspended, but that wasn't enough. He needed to be held accountable, to be removed completely. More than that, Marcus needed to know how deep this went. He slid into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel without turning on the engine. His mind replayed Jaden's words from the night before, the quiet, hesitant way he had admitted to everything. He just made it sound like it was normal, like it was something I had to do. How many other kids had been made to feel the same way? The thought was unbearable. He exhaled sharply and pulled out his phone. If he was going to get answers, he needed to start looking in the right places. The school couldn't be the only source of information. He started with the parents' group chat. It was mostly used for reminders about school events, questions about homework, the occasional complaint about cafeteria food. He scrolled through the messages quickly, searching for anything, any mention of missing money, strange behavior, anything that might hint at other victims. Nothing. His fingers tightened around the phone. Of course, there wouldn't be anything obvious. These kids, like Jaden, wouldn't have told their parents. Not unless they had been pushed to. Not unless they had been given a reason to believe they weren't alone. Marcus hesitated for a moment, then started typing. "Hey, everyone, I need to ask a serious question. Has anyone's kid mentioned losing their lunch money? Or maybe coming home hungrier than usual?" He stared at the message for a moment before hitting send. The response wasn't immediate, but that was expected. He checked the time. Most parents were probably busy at work, not glued to their phones. He set the device down on the passenger seat and leaned back against the headrest. Then, after a few minutes, the first response came. "Why do you ask?" Another followed. "My son said he lost his money a couple of times, but I didn't think much of it. Should I be worried?" Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Then another. "Same here. My daughter said she didn't want to buy lunch anymore, but I didn't think to ask why. Do you know something?" And then more. "Wait, is this about Mr. Clark? My kid never liked him, said he was too strict. This is weird. My son told me last month that he didn't need lunch money anymore. I thought he was just trying to save it. Now, I'm wondering if that was the truth." Marcus read each message carefully, his jaw tightening with every response. The pieces were falling into place. This wasn't just Jaden. It never had been. He picked up his phone and typed again. "I have proof that a teacher has been taking money from students. If your kid has experienced something like this, talk to them. Ask them if they ever felt pressured to hand over their money, and if they have, let me know." He hit send. The chat went silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, the messages started again. Some were hesitant. Some were outright shocked. But one thing was clear. There were others. Marcus exhaled, gripping the phone tightly. This was bigger than he had thought. He had enough now. Enough to make sure Clark never stepped foot in a classroom again. Without wasting another second, he started the car. His next stop wasn't home. It was the police station. If the school wouldn't handle this fast enough, then Marcus would make damn sure the law did. Clark had gotten away with this for long enough, but not anymore. Marcus sat in the police station lobby, his fingers tapping against his knee, his mind racing through every possible outcome. The room was quiet except for the low hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional shuffle of papers from the front desk. It was a small building, not particularly busy, but every second he sat there felt stretched, drawn out like time itself had decided to mock him. He had walked in with the recording still in his pocket, his phone buzzing with messages from the parents' group chat. More and more people were coming forward. Some were just suspicions, but others confirmed what he already knew. Mr. Clark had been stealing from students for months, maybe years. The sheer number of responses made Marcus's stomach churn. Jaden wasn't the only one. And now that the dam had broken, the truth was rushing in faster than he could process. A door swung open, and a woman in uniform stepped out. She looked around the lobby, her eyes landing on him. "Mr. Turner." Marcus stood, his pulse quickening. "Come with me," she said, leading him down a short hallway and into a small office. It wasn't much, a desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet in the corner, but it felt suffocating the moment the door shut behind them. She gestured for him to sit. "I'm Officer Delgado," she said, lowering herself into the chair opposite him. "You said you had evidence of misconduct at the school." Marcus pulled the recording device from his pocket and placed it on the desk between them. Not just misconduct. Theft, coercion. My son, along with other kids, has been handing over his lunch money to one of his teachers, Mr. Clark. He made it sound like a rule, something they had to do to avoid trouble. Officer Delgado's expression remained neutral, but Marcus saw the way her fingers twitched slightly as she reached for the recorder. "You recorded proof of this?" "Yes." She plugged in a pair of earbuds, pressed play, and for the next minute, the office was silent except for the faint sounds of the recording. Marcus didn't move. He didn't need to listen to it again. He had already memorized every word, every pause, every breath of hesitation in Jaden's voice. Instead, he watched Delgado's face. At first, she remained composed, her expression unreadable. But then her lips pressed into a thin line. Her brow furrowed slightly. By the time the recording ended, she leaned back in her chair, exhaling through her nose. "How long has this been going on?" Marcus clenched his fists. "Jaden says since last semester, but based on what I've been hearing from other parents, it's been happening for much longer than that." Delgado's gaze sharpened. "Other parents?" "I asked around." Marcus pulled out his phone, scrolling through the messages before holding it up for her to see. A lot of kids never told their parents. Some of them thought they were the only ones. Others thought they had done something wrong. Clark manipulated them. Delgado took a slow breath. "All right. Here's what's going to happen. We're going to open an investigation. We'll need to interview your son and any other students who were affected. If what you're saying is true, this isn't just a school matter, it's criminal." Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. "I want him held accountable, not just fired. I want charges pressed." "We'll do everything by the book," Delgado assured him, "but I'll be honest with you. Cases like this can be tricky. We need more than one recording. We need more than just one student willing to testify." Marcus had expected that. He took another breath, steadying himself before speaking. "You'll have more than one." By the time he left the station, his phone was still vibrating with new messages. Parents were talking to their kids. More stories were coming out. This wasn't just going to be one complaint. This was going to be a reckoning. Back at home, Jaden was sitting at the kitchen table when Marcus walked in. The boy looked up, a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. He had been quiet since the previous night, since Marcus had told him that he was going to handle things. Now, as Marcus sat down across from him, Jaden seemed to brace himself. "What happened?" Jaden asked. Marcus exhaled slowly. "I went to the police." Jaden's hands clenched slightly around the edge of the table. "What does that mean?" "It means they're investigating." Marcus watched his son carefully. "Other kids are coming forward, Jaden. You weren't the only one." Jaden's lips parted slightly, his brows drawn together. They weren't." Marcus shook his head. "No, some of them thought they were. Just like you." Jaden's throat moved as he swallowed. He sat back slightly, his fingers twitching against the wood of the table. There was something else in his expression now, something more than just relief, a kind of disbelief, like he had spent so long carrying this weight that he hadn't realized others had been carrying it too. "What's going to happen to him?" Jaden finally asked. Marcus's jaw tightened. "That depends on the investigation, but he won't be coming back to that school. Ever." Jaden nodded slowly. He looked down at his hands, his shoulders still tense. Then, after a long moment, he said, "Thank you." Marcus felt his chest tighten. He reached across the table, resting a hand on Jaden's arm. "You don't have to deal with this alone anymore, buddy. I promise." For the first time in weeks, Jaden met his father's gaze without looking away. That night, Marcus received a call from Principal Reynolds. The tone in the man's voice was different this time, less controlled, more weighted with the realization of what was happening. "The police were here," Reynolds said. "They're asking for student interviews." "They should be." Marcus replied. Reynolds hesitated. "This is going to get messy, Mr. Turner." Marcus let out a humorless laugh. "It already is." Clark wasn't just going to lose his job. He was going to lose everything. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt like justice was finally being served. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow across the kitchen. The house was quiet, filled only with the distant hum of a car passing outside and the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Marcus stood at the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee, his movements slower than usual. For the first time in weeks, the tension in his chest had eased, if only slightly. Jaden entered the kitchen a few moments later, still dressed in his sleepwear, his hair slightly disheveled. He hesitated at the doorway, as if unsure whether to speak first. His eyes flickered toward his father, searching for something in his expression. Marcus turned, leaning against the counter, offering a small nod of acknowledgement. "Hey, buddy," Marcus said, keeping his tone light. Jaden shuffled toward the table, pulling out a chair and sitting down. He reached for a piece of toast that Marcus had set out, but there was something in the way he moved, less hesitant than before, but not quite back to normal. It would take time. "Did you sleep okay?" Marcus asked, sipping his coffee. Jaden shrugged. "Better than before. It wasn't much, but it was something." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable, but was filled with the weight of everything that had happened. It had been only a few days since the police got involved, since the floodgates had opened and the truth about Mr. Clark had started spreading through the school, through the parents, through the entire community. Marcus had spent hours fielding phone calls, talking to other parents, speaking with officers about the investigation. The school had made an official statement, confirming that Clark had been placed on indefinite suspension while the investigation continued. But Marcus knew that wasn't enough. Clark wasn't coming back, not after everything that had come out. More students had spoken up, each story eerily similar to Jaden's. Clark had built his control carefully, ensuring that no one ever realized they weren't alone. He had relied on silence, on fear, on the idea that no one would ever dare question his authority. And now it was over. Marcus had spent years teaching his son that the world wasn't always fair, that people in positions of power didn't always use it responsibly. But this was different. This wasn't just about money. It was about trust, about control, about an adult taking advantage of the very students he was supposed to protect. And Jaden had been one of them. Marcus set his coffee down and looked at his son. "You know," he said, "I talked to one of the other parents yesterday. Their kid was one of the first to come forward after you." Jaden glanced up, his expression unreadable. "Yeah?" Marcus nodded. "They said they wouldn't have spoken up if they hadn't heard that someone else had already told the truth." "Your truth." Jaden's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of his plate. He looked down, chewing on his bottom lip. "I didn't think anyone else would understand." Marcus exhaled slowly. "That's what Clark wanted you to think. That's what people like him count on. But you weren't alone, Jaden. You never were." Jaden was silent for a moment, then nodded. He picked at his toast, his shoulders relaxing just the slightest bit. The doorbell rang, cutting through the quiet. Marcus set his mug aside and walked to the door, pulling it open. On the porch stood Principal Reynolds, dressed in his usual suit, but there was something different in the way he carried himself. Less polished, more exhausted. His face was lined with the weight of the past few days. "Mr. Turner," Reynolds said, his voice even. "Do you have a moment?" Marcus stepped aside, letting the principal in. Jaden remained at the table, but his posture straightened at the sight of his school's administrator. He watched carefully, his fingers still resting against his plate. Reynolds cleared his throat. "I won't take up much of your time. I wanted to give you an update personally." Marcus crossed his arms, waiting. Reynolds let out a slow breath. "Clark has resigned." Silence settled over the room. Marcus felt something inside him unclench. He had expected it, had known that there was no way Clark could remain at the school after everything, but hearing it confirmed out loud was different. Jaden's gaze snapped up. "For real?" Reynolds nodded. "For real. The school board accepted his resignation this morning, and I assure you he won't be working in another school again." He glanced at Marcus. "The police investigation is still ongoing, but with everything that's come to light, I don't think there's much of a question about the outcome." Marcus nodded slowly. "Good." Reynolds hesitated, then turned his attention to Jaden. "I also wanted to say, I'm sorry. This should never have happened. You should never have felt like you had to go through this alone." Jaden shifted uncomfortably, as if unsure how to respond. Finally, he just nodded. "Thanks." Reynolds glanced between them before straightening his jacket. "We're implementing new oversight policies to make sure something like this doesn't happen again. And if there's ever anything else that concerns you, my door is open. To both of you." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure he trusted the system to fix itself overnight, but he appreciated the effort. After the principal left, the house was quiet again. Jaden let out a slow breath. "He's really gone," he murmured. Marcus nodded. "He is." For the first time in weeks, Jaden looked lighter. It wasn't a perfect ending. There would still be questions, still be lingering effects from what had happened. But today, for the first time in a long time, Marcus saw something in his son's eyes that hadn't been there before. Relief. Hope. Jaden pushed his plate away and stood up. He hesitated for just a moment before walking toward his father, stopping just a foot away. "Thanks, Dad," he said quietly. Marcus reached out, ruffling his son's hair. "Always, buddy." Outside, the sun had risen higher in the sky, filling the world with a warmth that hadn't been there before. It was a new day, and for the first time in a long time, everything finally felt right. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next video. Share this video with others and check out more stories on our channel.